I'm Larry Cohn. I'd like to welcome you to our 12th annual Community Mental Health Conference. I hope that it'll be a stimulating, enjoyable, professionally rewarding, satisfying day for all of you to be here. We started these conferences in 2001. Marilyn and I tried to get together and decide where we felt we should put our efforts to try to remember Naomi, to try to help other people who had the problem she had. And what we quickly conceived was the area that we ought to address was stigma. Stigma seemed to be the major, for several reasons. First of all, stigma had been pervasive in Naomi's life. It was what she had to confront when she dealt with employment, what she had to deal with when she tried to explain her situation to her spouse, how she dealt with rapid recycling with her friends. And most of all, it was how she felt about herself. How does somebody she had bipolar, but somebody who had mental illness perceive themselves if society as a whole is creating a stigma against mental illness and against persons with mental illness. We also knew that about a year before we had our first conference, the Surgeon General had said that stigma was the foremost barrier, that was his words, to people receiving treatment for mental illness. We know even today that if you have 1 out of every 4 Americans who have mental illness, only about 7% get treatment. And the barrier is frequently stigma because people don't want to confront the problem and don't understand the problem. And so for all these reasons, our idea was that we had to have a conference that would address stigma or some way to educate people, because the only way to overcome stigma was through the educational process. We had conceived the idea of a conference that would be, as this conference is, not just for professionals and not just for consumers or people who are families of consumers, but for everyone, because by educating the population, we thought, and educating the general public, we would do the best we could to try to address this problem of eradicating stigma. We looked around for precedents of other organizations, churches, synagogues who had conferences of this type, and there were none. There were some churches and synagogues that invited a speaker to come in to talk to their individual congregation for a couple hours one day, but that was it. There was one congregation that had done something like that out in California, but there was nothing of this type. So we devised the conference, and we sort of did it by trial and error. The first conference we had was in 2002, April 7th, 2002. It went from 1 o'clock to 7:30 in the evening. We had keynote speaker Fred Goodwin. We had discussion groups. We had lunch. We had dinner. We had tried everything under the sun. I mean, we had real chutzpah to do this kind of conference. And we learned by that process many things. But I want to talk about the 3 things that we learned, I think, that are the most important that came out of that first conference. First, we learned that what the conferences are about is not just transmitting information. Yes, that's an important point, that you're going to learn more today. You're going to know, hopefully, when you leave, much more about trauma than you did when you started. But the conferences also provide, as a real benefit, the opportunity for people who are consumers or families of consumers to find a supportive audience, to share their experiences, to be able to know that they're not alone with what their problems are. That out there in this community, it's a caring community, treatment is available, people who can help are there. They are not alone. Everybody, I mean, there's a willingness and a desire for everyone to participate, and that feeling of camaraderie, that feeling that you're not confronting this singularly is, I think, an important aspect of what this conference is about. The second thing we learned was Marilyn and I had tried to put together this first conference by ourselves. And it was a disaster. I mean, we expected 50 to 60 people. Suddenly, over 100 came in. We were trying to put them in the right discussion groups, create these kind of booklets for them. We didn't know what we were doing. And so what we learned was we better get help. And we better get somebody who knew what they were doing and who could make sure that we didn't have all the fiasco that we had gone through repeat itself. So for the second conference, we hired a executive director. It's Jill Randall. Jill had been the executive director here at Beth Emmet, and Jill has been, we have never had those fiascos again. And Jill, if you're here, stand up, because we owe you a great debt of gratitude. We also created and have had, even at the first conference, a committee of individuals representing a host of different mental health groups and other interested people in the mental health field who work together starting in July. We're going to have our first meeting in July, and work through the year to plan the conferences, to deal with the logistics, to come up with who is the best discussion leaders, and to guide us with the expertise and with the skill that we need to have to make it successful. And those individuals are on your, what is this, aqua turquoise colored card. We owe them a great debt of thank you too, so I'd like to recognize them as well. We receive great support from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. We're now an institute there. Support from the president, Michael Horowitz, who's was the moderator for our first conference, is going to be the moderator again today. From the new president, Patricia Arando, she's here too, thank you. Jill Glenn, and others there who make it possible. We get support always from the staff here at Beth Emmet, Becky Kaplan, and everyone here. And of course, we owe a great debt of gratitude to the individuals who are coming here to be the panelists, to be the discussion leaders, and to participate in the conference. We owe a debt to the students from the Chicago School. They're in, I think, white shirts or white shirts with jackets on, or who are going to be here to help you if you need any guidance, if you don't know where to go, if you need any kind of help, they're going to be here. And finally, I want to thank all those who have donated, who've made contributions to the Institute, because without your financial support, we couldn't put on the conference and the other activities we do. So that's the second thing we learned. And finally, what we learned was that the process of these conferences is a work in progress. They evolve. We do things differently each conference, because no matter how good we think of one conference is, the next conference can be better. And we do that by getting your evaluations, by reading them over. That's this yellow sheet that's in your book, and studying them and trying to find out what we can do to make each conference better. And you can see we're doing a number of things today that we have not done in the past. We're obviously starting earlier and ending earlier. That was one suggestion. We're providing an opportunity for a second discussion group, which we haven't done before. We're going to have instead of having a separate time to eat lunches are going to be part of the what you have with your first discussion group in the rooms. So cut down the eating time, have more content time. All of this is to try to improve the conferences. Are these good ideas? I hope they are, but that's what we need to find out from you. And we can only find that out if you fill out the evaluations and give us what ideas as to what you would like us to address in future conferences. Like I said, what we decided after that first conference, after we saw the response, was that we were going to continue. We've had 11 conferences since then. We've covered depression, bipolar, addiction, anxiety disorders. We try to do the timely, significant areas. When we planned trauma, we didn't know that we were later going to have Boston and Newton and all the other events that have happened this year, soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, all these traumatic events that make trauma in the centerpiece of the news. Next year, the conference is going to be on Sunday, June 1st, and we're going to pick another subject that we feel really needs to be addressed these days, and that's suicide. Suicide, how to prevent it, how to deal with the consequences and the impact of it It's going to be, I think, a very challenging subject, but I think it's going to be something that we need to talk about in our society because it's there and we can't ignore it. A word about the logistics for those who aren't familiar. When I finish, and I'm going to have, after the first speakers, we'll start the panel discussion. I'll introduce Michael Horowitz. The panelists will each come up here and talk for a period of time. While they're talking, you should have in your brochure a white index card. If you have questions for them, write it down on the index card. We'll then take the index cards, take about a 10-minute break, I think, and collate them, and then ask to have question and answer period to follow. When the question and answer period is over, go to your discussion group, your first discussion group. I hope you all know where that is. Your lunches will be there for you. We'll have the discussion group. When it concludes, there will be a dessert reception and in chance to look at the exhibits if you haven't already done so in the room that's right behind here, the Crown Room. I mean the wine room. And then those who have signed up for it will have a chance to go to their second discussion group. That's the format we'll try this time, and we hope it will be successful. As those who have attended past conferences know, we've always tried to have both a spiritual and a secular component to our conferences. We believe that not only prayer and spiritual involvement help in the healing process, it has to be, combining everything is very important. And what we have today for our first speaker is someone who's got a ability and a unique expertise in both the spiritual and the secular side of mental health. Rabbi Eleanor Smith was ordained from Hebrew Union College. She came to Beth Emmet in 93, and was our rabbi here for 7 years, assistant, then associate rabbi. Rabbi Smith was everything a rabbi wanted from the congregation. She was warm, she was empathic, she was bright, she was a great educational leader, a friend, I mean, all those things and more. And when she decided in 2000 that she wanted to move on and needed to fulfill her life better and what she communicate better and deal with the problems of the world better by getting a degree in medicine, it was bittersweet. I mean, we knew this was a wonderful thing for Rabbi Smith, but at the same time, we were really sad to see her go. And she's a beloved and fondly remembered rabbi here. Subsequently, Rabbi Smith got her degree in MD from the University of Chicago, did her residency at North Shore University Systems here, and now is a private practitioner in internal medicine in Evanston. So it's my pleasure to welcome up here to the podium and have as our first speaker, personally very gratifying for me and a great honor to have Rabbi Dr. Eleanor Smith.
I am enormously grateful to be here today and thank Larry and Marilyn for the opportunity and the privilege to share these few moments with you. In recent weeks, both the lay and professional press have noted the terrible finding that for the past decade and more, suicide rates amongst middle-aged adults in America rose by almost 30%. Among adults in their 50s, which characterizes many of us here in the room, the rate rose nearly 50%. Suicide by hanging increased nearly 80%. What these awful numbers mean, how precisely they quantify a rising tide of despair, is open for interpretation. But as we gather today for communion and collaboration in deepening our understanding of trauma, I am aware that we step through a fragile time when the prevalence of human suffering and anxiety can be vividly captured by so sterile a thing as statistics. Each of us carries an intensely personal definition of trauma and an equally personal definition of spirituality. In these few moments of opportunity to launch our shared conversation today, I would like to offer a bit of language that we might use as we weave through the common and private purpose that brings us here today. Trauma is a thing that happens without permission or invitation, a darkness that slips through the curtain, an intruder that breaches the walls of the self that each of us holds sacred. Trauma is the violation that is sometimes the very first event to illuminate these sacred boundaries. It is an undeserved and jarring loss of freedom, the rough handling of another's autonomy. It is the betrayal of an internal organ that suddenly switches function, the trusted hand that touches the wrong way, the wrong place. Trauma is not just the absence of justice, it is an inversion of justice, a superimposed new definition of self that correlates with nothing we knew about ourselves before the moment of trauma. It is the acute state of suffering without haven, the desolate lack of sanctuary in a time of greatest vulnerability. It is the unceremonious dunk in the muck of shame with no clear place to wash and dry. In his play, No Exit, Jean-Paul Sartre says, "Hell is other people." Trauma folds into a human life, into a community, like an egg into batter, diffuse, reconfigured, irretrievable in its original form, and yet touching everything. I am moved that we are hundreds of souls here on a Sunday morning to gather around the fire of this thing that burns around us and within so many, here in our nation of freedom and plenty. We are survivors and handmaidens to survival, and people who have also caused great suffering to others, with or without intent. Beyond therapists, medication, acupuncture, meditative practices, sometimes bitterness, and ideally, the funneling of our hurts into redemptive energies, with what tools do we hold our place in the community of the living, the well, the whole, after trauma? I'll call that part of our strategy spirituality. For many, spirituality wears the garments of a particular religious tradition that preordains times for joy and times for lament, offers rules of engagement and prayers for healing, points clearly to a force in charge and the means of reckoning for all comers. For others, such established traditions are foreign or were tried and discarded as a poor fit, especially where those traditions were silent or worse, damning about a one with our particular injury, status, or need. Spirituality is a certainty that our individual experience is not all that there is, that the larger cartography of the created world has irreducible beauty and goodness, that hope for ourselves and others, for our community, is not a fool's mission. None can fully understand the design of the Creator, but to live through the years, to endure, is to see that the infinite variety of human suffering is matched and exceeded by the breathtaking beauty of human love and the loveliness of the natural world. Spirituality is the witnessing that sometimes those with the most unimaginable pain summon the most astonishing grace and power to do well, to change the path for others and feel whole. Where they go, we may follow. In medicine, we have many mechanisms and much language for healing. In the language regarding physical wounds, our first goal is to what we call approximate the edges, to try as faithfully as we can to line up the parts that once were a single whole, then place something mechanical to hold these parts together, a suture, a staple, a bandage. Over time, the severed parts learn to recognize each other, to make a new alignment that will more or less serve the function of the old way. Through the conversations, learning, teaching, and revelations that occur throughout our day ahead, let this be our goal, to approximate the edges. In our varying states of service and healing, let us see the beauty and function of the new self. May our endeavors be blessed. Amen.
It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's panel discussion, who will in turn introduce the panelist. Dr. Michael Horowitz was the moderator for our first panel in 2002. At that time, he was the president of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, which is a institute. It had offices in Union Station, a small little campus, and today it's the largest school of its kind in the world. Michael is not only the president of the Chicago School, but of a group called the Chicago School Education System, I think I've got it right, which consists of Pacific Oaks College and Children's School, the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, the Santa Barbara and Ventura Colleges of Law. And the Chicago School has the multi-campus online programs with, 4,000 or so, I think, students this year. Michael is served as a faculty member, an administrator, and is recognized as a real innovator in the field of education. So we're really excited about having Michael back here as our moderator, and he will in turn introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Larry. Good morning. And can I ask that we give a round of applause for Larry and Marilyn Cohen for their generosity. In giving to us, to our community, with this wonderful education and community event. Larry mentioned the Chicago School's involvement with the Nomi Ruth Cohen Institute. After 5 or 6 years of working together, I asked the Cohens to make the Nomi Ruth then Foundation part of the Chicago School, because I thought the work of this conference was so important and needed an institutional home for the long term. And I'm so pleased that since 2008, we've been working together as one organization. Larry mentioned we have over 4,000 students, and many of them are volunteers with us here today. And what's so important about having the Institute as part of our school is that public education, public dialogue about mental illness, mental health, all of the issues that were just mentioned are so very important to us. And while we want our students to learn to be healers, we also want them to learn to engage very directly with the public and educate themselves and the public in that conversation. So I think we're making progress in the perception and treatment of mental illness, but there's so much more to be done. And Rabbi Smith did a wonderful job in defining and giving words and shape to trauma. It really does affect all aspects of our community, all socioeconomic levels, every age group, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic group. And of course, unfortunately, we know even here in the city of Chicago, which has violence on a daily basis, certain communities in our larger community and around the world, those that suffer war and other ravages, have the impact of trauma even more. So psychologists and healers obviously can help people start to work through trauma, and we hope that today will be a big part of that. And our three panelists will help us understand the impact of trauma and how we can begin to heal personally and as a community. So I'm going to introduce them all in advance, and we'll have them then come up one at a time, and then we'll have a very lively question and answer session. I also want to point out that in your packet, you have this card, I'm looking for help, and we hope you'll take a moment today to take the National Suicide Prevention Hotline and the National Treatment Locator number and make it part of your contacts in your phone. So our panel today is quite distinguished. We have Dr. Cassandra Kissel, a research assistant professor at Northwestern University. She's principal investigator and project co-director for the Treatment Services and Adaptation Center of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and a trauma consultant and project director for the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. She's written several articles and book chapters related to these issues. Our second speaker is Dr. Bradley Stolbach. He's an associate professor of clinical pediatrics at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine and supervisor of trauma-related psychological services at La Rabida Children's Hospital, where he also directs the Chicago Child Trauma Center. Their primary mission is to provide expert trauma-focused psychological services to urban African American children and families living in poverty. And he's worked with abused and traumatized children for over 25 years. And finally, we'll hear at the end from Tonir Kane, a consumer advocate with a very powerful story to share. She's a courageous survivor of childhood abuse, addiction, unrelenting violence, and numerous incarcerations. And she really exemplifies the resiliency of the human spirit, and now through her own professional work, which promotes that where there's breath, there's hope. She's currently team leader for the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care within the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. So let's kick things off by welcoming Dr. Kissel. Dr. Stolbach.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone, for being here. It's really a great honor and privilege, and I want to especially thank Rabbi Dr. Smith for the beautiful metaphor that you've given us. It's all about putting parts together so they can heal the way that they're meant to be. I could easily talk for hours and hours about all of these issues, as I'm sure many of us in the room could, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to keep it relatively brief, but there is a lot I have to say. And I think the last time I gave a speech at a synagogue, I was my bar mitzvah. So I'm feeling a little anxious more than usual. I'm not going to do this in Hebrew. So I always like to start with this because when we're talking about trauma, what we're talking about is horrific moments in individual lives. And oftentimes that is starting in childhood. And so I always want us to stay grounded in the experience of people who live these stories every day. And of course, we're going to hear a very powerful story from Tonir. This is another courageous survivor of complex trauma, Dr. Maya Angelou, and this is what she has to say, and it's very quick, and it actually sums it up very nicely, I think. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. That is really the key to healing trauma. Facing it, acknowledging it, addressing it. We know that trauma is pretty much related to everything. And in 1998, a seminal paper was published on the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. How many have heard of that? Okay. So it's interesting that the doctor who trained after this was published, you didn't raise your hand. What they found in the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and they looked at 17,000 people in Kaiser Permanente in California. This was started by a doctor who did work with obesity named Vince Felitti, who's also a great hero. And they simply asked people to tell them whether they had had any of these different kinds of experiences in childhood. And what they found is that the more of those kinds of experiences a person had, the more likely they were to have all sorts of problems, not just emotional problems or psychiatric problems, physical problems. In fact, the number of different kinds of adverse childhood experiences a person had were directly related to all the leading causes of early death. Now, this knowledge has been around for quite some time, but it's not, for some reason, affecting how we approach our problems from a public health perspective. Another thing that the ACEs study tells us is that trauma is not really about an event. It's, you know, we talk about the effects of this traumatic event or that traumatic event. Most of the time, these things happen together. They don't happen in isolation. We talk about them as if they do, but most of the time that's not how they happen in nature. So sexual abuse is a horrible thing. It's a horrible traumatic thing. But most of the time when there's sexual abuse, there are other kinds of trauma and adverse childhood experiences going on that shape that horrible thing. This is just in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. You can see that fewer than a quarter of the children served throughout the network have experienced just one type of trauma. And almost 45% have experienced 4 or more types. One of the things the ACE study tells us is that there's 4 seems to be a kind of magic number, is what is the cumulative burden that one can carry, and if you have 4 or more, you're in a lot greater risk for many, many things. This is just the kids that we serve at our center. This is their trauma exposure, and they average nearly 3 different types of trauma that they've experienced. Sexual abuse, domestic violence, physical abuse. These are violent traumas. You can see, if you're exposed to domestic violence and you're coming to see us, you've also been exposed to abuse. Most of the trauma is not single episode, it's ongoing. And then this is just their other ACEs, and they're averaging over 3.5 different types of adverse childhood experience. So if you put that together, and the average age of these children is about 9. So we're talking about not events, we're talking about lives. And when we're talking about children especially, but really about any of us, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to think of ourselves as individuals, especially if we're talking about trauma, because trauma and the way we deal with trauma is all about our attachment systems. So the attachment behavioral system is an evolved behavioral system that functions to promote the protection and safety of the attached person. And this system is activated by internal and external stressors or threats. So that's why it's so important to trauma and our responses to trauma. So what happens? You have, let's take just a simple everyday kind of example. You have a baby, and the baby's hungry. So what does the baby do? Cries. The baby cries. Why? Because the baby is seeking proximity of the primary attachment figure. The baby can't get up and walk and go get her, right? So the baby cries. In a good attachment behavior system, a good enough attachment behavior system, if they're lucky enough to have that, then the primary caregiver is available to do what? Feed. I heard a lot of feed the baby. That's right. That's not all they do. So they have to go to the baby, first of all. They also have a proximity-seeking response that happens when that baby cries. Any of us who spent a lot of time around babies is very familiar with that, right? So then we go to the baby, and the mom maybe picks the baby up, right? And she's not just getting the food and saying, okay, here you go, here's your bottle, right? She's probably doing something like this, right? And what else might she be doing while she's moving with the baby? Talking, singing, beautiful. Yes. Yes, I won't sing, but, right? It's going to be okay. Oh, you're hungry. Oh, she's figuring out what's going on. She's putting words to that baby's internal experience, right? And as she does that, both the baby and the mother calm down. It's co-regulation. And then she feeds the baby, and then everything's good, right? Then we move on. That's a nice attachment behavior system working. There are many, many circumstances where that's not available for many, many reasons. But when it is available, that's how the capacity for emotional behavioral self-regulation develops, and the capacity for the coherent self. It's also how we get to understand what human beings are and what relationships are. What are people? What are they for? And so we develop complementary representations of self and other that shape our understanding of how to be in the world and who to be in the world. And these models reflect our appraisal of and confidence in the self as acceptable and worthy of care and protection. And the attachment figure's desire, ability, and availability to provide protection and care. And this is the meaning we make regardless of the reasons that either we have that, we're lucky enough to have that available, or we're not. Or that primary attachment figure can't do it for us. We make that about us and our value, our worth. So when we talk about trauma, most of the time what we're talking about is complex trauma. And what that means for me is exposure to multiple forms of violence and other potentially traumatic stressors in the context of attachment behavior systems that are unable to provide protection, care, and comfort. So it's the combination. And that's a lot of the children that Cassie's going to be talking about, and that was Tonier's experience. That is that combination that shapes what happens developmentally as we go through our lives. These are just some basic ideas about trauma and what we mean when we're talking about traumatic stressors. They're experiences that overwhelm our capacity to integrate them. And so then if we can't integrate them, they get split off, and then we alternate between functioning as if it's still happening, as if we're under constant threat, or functioning as if it never happened. And so even though a lot of the memories, associations of that experience remain inaccessible to our consciousness, they shape who we are and what we do, and how we perceive what's happening around us. So trauma shapes all of the things that we need to be able to do to be human and to engage in relationships. The ability to modulate, tolerate, or recover from extreme affect states, regulation of bodily functions, capacity to know emotions or bodily states, the capacity to describe emotions or bodily states, the capacity to perceive threat, including reading of safety and danger cues, self-protection, self-soothing, the ability to initiate and sustain goal-directed behavior, the coherent self, coherent identity, and the capacity to regulate empathic arousal. So a simple way to say that is that complex trauma has profound effects on development, functioning, personality, and the capacity to live, love, and be loved. And we don't have, in our current diagnostic system, a way to describe that one could make a diagnosis. Makes it difficult to develop the right treatments and to get them to be anointed as evidence-based and all that sort of thing. In the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, again, fewer than a quarter of kids met criteria for PTSD. So this is a network of kids who are exposed to multiple types of trauma, and 3/4 of them can't have the one trauma diagnosis we have. So why does it matter anyway, right? Doesn't, I mean, it's all just clinical, stuff that we make up anyway. So why does it matter? Here's one way that it matters. We're talking about all the violence happening in the city of Chicago. And there's a lot of attention to law enforcement responses to this violence. But we're not paying much attention to how is it possible that this is happening. And this is just a very small, unscientific survey that my colleague Eddie Bocanegra did, and he asked the kids that he works with to tell about their trauma experiences. And this is what he found. All of them exposed to violence, both in their families and their communities. We make an artificial distinction between these different types of violence. The average age of first exposure that these kids reported was 6, and they averaged 10 different types. They averaged almost 3 different types of other adversity. So there's their combined total, nearly 13. And you'll find the same thing if you go in prison and you ask people, you'll find the same thing. We've done it. If you go in residential settings, you're going to find the same thing. So again, why does it matter? This is the United Nations definition of a child soldier. A child soldier is any person under 18 years of age who is part of any kind of regular or irregular armed force or armed group in any capacity, including but not limited to cooks, porters, messengers, and anyone accompanying such groups other than family members. The definition includes girls recruited for sexual purposes and for forced marriage. It does not therefore only refer to a child who is carrying or has carried arms. The lens that we use to see what's happening around us and to see the people that are around us shapes everything we think and do in response to them. If the kids that Eddie talked to were in Uganda or Nepal, or Colombia, they wouldn't be called gangbangers, they would be called child soldiers. And there would be some NGO going in there to try to figure out what are the solutions to the problems. And the solutions would have to do with trauma, community trauma, individual trauma, and trauma at the societal level. We like to lock them up, right? You're going to hear from somebody who knows that very, very well. And this is just one of those kids. 13 years old. He's already witnessed 3 homicides. This is his life if you try to look at it in developmental context. And that black line there is the first time that he did something on behalf of a street organization. He held a gun for his brother at the age of 8. Now, if ultimately he ends up killing somebody, what are we going to do with him? Lock him up. Throw away the key. Does that seem right? So that's the bad news, right? The good news is that we know a lot about how people heal. So we got to go back to someone who's a great model of that. The way we heal is we face what happened. These are a few evidence-based or evidence-informed interventions that at our center that we use. There are others. The core components of treatment for complex trauma are safety, self-regulation, self-reflective information processing, trauma experience integration, relational engagement, and positive affect enhancement. All right, if we have interventions that facilitate all of these things, then we help people to heal, and then their lives are not controlled by their traumatic past. This is just kids in Illinois in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's database, and that shows you their from baseline to follow-up, their symptoms. Getting trauma-focused intervention, some of which probably isn't even that good, right? You can see the effect. And this is one more story. This is Mario. So Mario was exposed to a similar number of traumas and ACEs as Alfonso was, including being shot when he was 9 years old. Where's my paper? I have Mario's story here somewhere, but he was psychiatrically hospitalized, put in alternative schools many, many times throughout time he was growing up. During that time, he was exposed to 8 different types of traumatic stress. None of the intervention addressed any of the things that he had been through. In many settings, they didn't even ask him about it. He finally ended up coming to see us when he was 16. And this is a little bit of what
When he was 16, Mario got hooked up with the Chicago Child Trauma Center at La Rabida Children's Hospital. And he started to understand why the care he got before wasn't getting results.
Some people was trying to help me, but they was trying to cure me. It's like no cure, but it's ways to deal with us.
The treatments at La Rabida focus on building those skills, how to calm himself down or cope with flashbacks, and they capitalize on what psychologists call protective factors. For Mario, strength came from a bond with his grandmother. He had his intellect and his talent with the pen and the basketball. So by the time his brain was reaching maturity, he was ready to throw off some of his burden.
If you think about the things that happen to you and you stay there thinking about that and not moving, you'll drown. I feel like in life, we all are in the water, and we're all trying to swim and make it. And sometimes it do take a light. Maybe you don't see which way to go. Maybe you think underneath is somewhere different. But for me, when people's helped me out, that was that light above that had me kept swimming.
So this isn't about the Chicago Child Trauma Center or the treatments we use. It's not about Mario even. This is about how it's possible to help people to heal after they've been exposed to horrific experiences, or on the other hand, how it's possible to further exacerbate or do further damage. These are the key messages for me that are central to healing trauma. It's not happening now. You're safe, and not only are you safe, you're worthy of being safe. You're not inherently dangerous or toxic, meaning what is inside you cannot hurt other people. You're good, and you have a future. Think what would happen to the violence in Chicago if these messages were being sent to our children. So I'm going to end with one more hero, and then we're going to turn it over to some other heroes. And this is Walter Smith, a psychologist in Pittsburgh, dedicating his life work to preventing child abuse by strengthening families and communities. As a child, he experienced sexual and physical abuse perpetrated by a family member. The isolation of his nuclear family of origin and the silence of those who could have risen to protect drives his passion to change our social permission and tolerance for 1 in 5 children sexually abused in the United States before age 18. He believes the rights of children to have safety, voice, and choice is the last great civil rights battle to wage in America. See why he's a hero of mine? As an African-American man, he uses civil rights as a metaphor because it speaks to the need for freedom and the silent tolerance of oppression. To even dare speak of children as having power, voice, and rights challenges custom, culture, and law. Yet his will to defy is balanced with the irony of healing from great pain. Like so many, it is through suffering that peace is discovered and understood. Exploring pain finds courage. Defying fear uncovers hope. Facing shame reveals empathy. The journey of healing has given more than the pain stole, an important message to those who do not speak their darkness. And this conference is saying what he says now. By all means, speak. By voice, pen, and action, speak. To self, family, and unknown others, speak. Speak softly and loud, angrily and welcoming. Learn the many voices it takes to be heard and join the effort to quiet the silence. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Brad. And I have to say, it's hard for me to pause there. I'd like to jump in with some questions, but I know there's a structure to this, and I know at dinner last night we had the opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better, and Brad and I have been fortunate to work together for many years, and it just was happenstance when Jill Randall reached out to us, I would say almost a year ago now, that we were happy that we were on the same panel. And both of us have also had the opportunity to hear Tonier's compelling story, so I'm looking forward to hearing it again today. So just to give you a little bit of sense, because Brad's always a hard act to follow, Brad and I had a couple of conversations as far as how we would divide this up. And one of the things, and I think this will follow nicely with what Tonier is going to be talking about, is that Brad offered us an important framework for understanding trauma, for understanding complex trauma, and talked about the individual impact and how this impacts so many individuals across this country and within other countries. What I'm going to do is talk more about the systems level impact of trauma, and particularly the systems that many of us, I'm guessing, interface with both as professionals, as family members, as community members, and what we can also do to hopefully make our work more trauma informed. And then I know that Tonir will also talk about her personal story and her work with systems, and I think we'll bring this home with her compelling ideas and advice for all of us that we can take to heart. So just a question. I know Brad referenced the NCTSN, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. How many folks have heard of the NCTSN or have access to their resources? Okay, so a good number, I would say maybe about half or maybe less, and I think Brad is smiling here. We have both been members of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in various capacities from the beginning, and it's a wonderful resource that I want you all to be aware of. At the end of my set of slides, we'll be listing several different resources, websites that folks can access, and I think in some ways people have said the NCTSN is the best well-kept secret. I hope it's getting more visibility at this point, but it's a unique congressional initiative. I'm just going to quickly touch on what it is because it really has done a lot to move the work forward in the field of trauma and child traumatic stress and work with trauma-informed systems. And it was established about a decade ago. It's a unique congressional initiative that was really meant to further the mission of trauma and improve our understanding of trauma and enhance access to services across the country. And currently, I'm going to give you a map of where the NCTSN is, and I'm going to use my laser pointer on occasion. You'll see in Illinois alone, we have 7 NCTSN centers, and I'm not sure if you're all aware of that. And those centers are a combination of community-based practice centers and university-based centers. Our center at Northwestern is a university-based center, so we focus on infrastructure development, training, consultation, and really trying to work with different service systems in enhancing their level of trauma knowledge and skill. So there are 11 centers in the U.S., and you'll see, I mean, there's a lot of densely populated centers in the eastern half of the country, unfortunately, but only I think there are about 44 states in the U.S. that have any funded or formally funded what's known as an affiliate center, and so there are only about 7 states that have had no NCTSN presence. So it does have a widespread impact, and I think the idea with SAMHSA being the funder of the NCTSN is that all of these resources, the NCTSN website, which is just www.nctsn.org, has several resources for professionals, for family members, for caregivers, that touching on every type of trauma that you can imagine. So it's a wonderful resource for folks to be aware of. Now, I know in many different respects, Michael, Brad, others already touched on this, but I just want to put up a few of the facts and figures, if this will allow me to do that. And so this is something I think we know already, but just pointing out some facts from some large-scale studies. Over a third of kids in the U.S. from the broad population have experienced at least one form of trauma before the age of 16. However, as Brad talked about, as you'll hear about, that one trauma is not the norm, right? Most of kids who are traumatized experience multiple forms of trauma. Additionally, adults, more than 60% of American males and 51% of females report any lifetime exposure to trauma, and about 1 in 3 women, think about this, in the population at large will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. So that's pretty profound. And if we think about that from whatever your vantage point is, how well are we identifying that, how well are we assessing it, and how well are we addressing that from each of our vantage points? I think we've done a lot of work, but there's still a lot more work to do. This last point I think is critical, and you'll hear about it from Brad, from Tonir as well, that the key message, though, is strengths have a real important role in recovery from trauma, in buffering folks from the longer-term impact of trauma. And those things are really important to keep in mind when you have somewhat of what looks like a bleak picture. And so as much as we can do to capitalize on those strengths, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done in that regard and what the NCTSN has done, I think the more hope, recovery, resiliency that we have. So those are things that are important to keep in mind. So again, a common theme for systems. So trauma really impacts all of the systems that I'm guessing many of you interface with. And this is not even listing all this. I realize I don't have religious organizations in here as well. So there's several different ways that trauma intersects with all of the work that we're doing and all of the, as consumers, all of the systems that I'm guessing many of you interface with. However, again, the question is, how much are we carefully attending to that? One of the things that we talked about earlier are the different rates of trauma in different systems. Brad talked about the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is comprised of mental health centers, juvenile justice, child welfare. But overall, when we look at two systems, we do a lot of work with child welfare and juvenile justice. And the rates within those systems are particularly high. In fact, one of the stats I wanted to reference was that of youth who are persistent, repeat juvenile offenders, at least 92% of those youth have been exposed to at least one form of trauma. So think about that, and then think about the juvenile justice systems that you may be familiar with, that you may be interfacing with. How much are they attending to trauma, identifying trauma, assessing trauma? Again, it's an area that I think we have a lot more work to do in. And it's similarly high for child welfare. I'll be sharing some of the statistics, some of the data that we've collected within child welfare just to show you how rates are similar. And again, it's not just single trauma, it's complex trauma. It's multiply traumatized kids. And one of the things that we know from our work there is that we often have to keep that broader perspective in mind in terms of how we look at those kids. Because if we just look for PTSD, we may be missing the boat in terms of what those kids look like. So one of the things that we do know within, for instance, mental health settings, I think, thanks to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, which is the larger adult post-traumatic stress disorder organization, there's been a lot of work and I think a lot of inroads that have been made within the mental health system, but I would say that's not across the board. However, in the work that we do within child welfare and in juvenile justice, not only is good trauma assessment practice in place, but oftentimes not a good assessment practice, right? So are we really identifying the needs in a careful way of those kids? And if you think about the types, when somebody thinks about embedding, a lot of the work that we do is around the area of assessment. And if you just think about embedding an assessment strategy that says, okay, we're gonna get at trauma history and just post-traumatic stress disorder, if you don't see any evidence there, as Brad alluded to, you may miss the boat. We may not be seeing the full picture of that child. So again, the importance of carefully attending to a broad range of symptoms and reactions. And then as a result, if kids are not getting that appropriate assessment, then what does their treatment look like? Are they being channeled into the appropriate treatment that may be trauma-informed? Are those needs being identified and appropriately addressed? And then comes the issue of how these kids are labeled in those systems. And I think this is critical for the mission of this institute, because oftentimes those kids in those systems, and I know we'll be hearing more about this from Tonir, are labeled as, both kids and adults who interface with those systems are labeled as bad kids, or bad adults, or bad seeds, and they're blamed for all of the kinds of behaviors that they had without really understanding and identifying what may be underlying those behaviors. And then along with that comes the stigma of saying, I did something wrong, right? And the other thing that we know is, in addition to trauma, whatever way we may define the broader landscape of trauma, they also often come from already oppressed environments, discrimination, poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So there are several other ongoing stressors that these youth or adults may be experiencing. So if you can see this, if folks can see this, so this is just some of our data from child welfare. And one of the things that's important to note here is that oftentimes, I think historically, when we've talked about trauma, folks have focused on kind of the more violent kinds of trauma. And even post-traumatic stress disorder, if you're familiar with that diagnosis, to make the gateway to get a post-traumatic stress disorder, you need what's called a criterion A stressor. So you need one of those more violent kinds of traumas, right? So what happens to all these kids here, the ones with neglect? Now the issue, and if you look at the diagnosis literally, you need more than just neglect. You need more than just emotional abuse to meet criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD. Now that has all sorts of implications, given that not just in Illinois, but across the country, by far neglect is the most common form of reason for removal. And as Brad talked about the attachment system, profound, chronic neglect can have pervasive, profound impacts on a child's development, a child's attachment system. So it's really important when we do an assessment of trauma to really assess the broad range of traumatic experiences. This is just looking again at our kids in child welfare, and just to point out, those kids who have multiple traumas, if you look at the green bar, those kids that we would define as complex trauma or multiply traumatized kids have many more needs. They have many more risk behaviors, so things that we're talking about in relation to this institute, for instance, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of physical aggression, sexual aggression, significantly more than those who just have one kind of trauma. The reason this is important is that as we work with systems, and the reason I always like to show data at a presentation is because this is how, we don't use it just for research purposes, we use it to make the case for the kinds of work that needs to be done in a system. We use it to suggest that, are we really paying attention to those multiply traumatized kids and how perhaps their needs may be different? And again, using that broader trauma lens beyond just simple PTSD. For those who work in child welfare, you also may know about the impact of placement disruptions on youth. And so it's an important, significant negative outcome for kids who are being, if you think about how the attachment system may be disrupted already, think about the profound impact of kids who get bumped around from placement to placement, often because, right, of some of those risk behaviors that they may be challenging to manage. But yet, one of the things we're trying to do in our consultation with the Illinois Child Welfare System is have them pay attention to what's driving those placement disruptions? How can we prevent them? And what this slide is showing us just simply is those kids who are multiply traumatized and have both the violent and more attachment-based traumas are much more likely, about 26 times more likely, to have a placement disruption in the 2 years following entry into care. So if we have that lens coming into the system, what can we do differently to attend to these kids who are multiply traumatized? And then the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder and how it may be misdiagnosed or mislabeled as something else. So we had an interesting conversation over dinner. I know many folks have paid attention to this issue of diagnosis and misdiagnosis. We've done a lot of work at our center. I know Brad has, I know many in this room have, around trying to make the case for a new diagnosis for complex trauma, of which there currently is not one. In the DSM. However, I think even in the absence of that, it's really important that we pay attention to how we can better educate those we work with around connecting the dots, even if there are multiple diagnoses. So what we often see is kids who have complex trauma may get diagnosed with, may or may not get diagnosed with PTSD, but may often have a range of depressive disorders, oppositional defiant disorder, reactive attachment disorders, learning difficulties. But yet, if we have that range of disorders, how are we serving those kids? One of the things, one of our colleagues, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's been a pioneer in this field for many years, has said, oftentimes what this leads to is a piecemeal approach to these youth, to these adults, where we're not looking at them and treating them as a holistic individual, but rather looking at these things in isolation. So how can we help folks connect the dots and understand this as part of their composite trauma picture? Similarly, when I underscore this, when a trauma assessment is not conducted, things that are actually PTSD may get mislabeled as something like attention deficit disorder because some of those biphasic kind of alternating inattention hyperactivity may actually truly be PTSD. So think about the negative implications of that. Similar psychotic disorders. We do a lot of work around, one of our new areas that we focus on is on the area of dissociation. And oftentimes in our work in residential, we see that youth who are actually dissociative may get mislabeled as having a psychotic disorder. And so if you think about the implications for that, there are many negative implications, the trajectory that can follow that child, the mismedication, and how that label can stick with them for many, many years. So it's really important for us to attend to that more carefully as a system. This just says the same thing in a way that shows that trauma may be a missing link to a lot of these issues that we are treating already, especially in high-end systems. So now I'm going to skip ahead to just a little bit on a trauma-informed service system. So thanks to the NCTSN, we do have some, I think, really useful definitions of what a trauma-informed service system is. And I think this, I'm not going to read through all of this right now, but it's a system where all providers or programs within a particular system recognize and respond to the impact of traumatic stress. All programs and agencies infuse knowledge, awareness, skill building into their organizational cultures and practices. So that does not mean a one-time training. That means ongoing staff support, linking this as a part of your culture. And we've done a lot of work around that. I know many of us have done this work in this room, so we'd be happy to talk to you further about ways to do that and enhance it within your organization if that's something you'd like to do more of. And again, a trauma-informed professional, one who understands the impact of trauma on a child and adult's behavior, infuses this into their planning in their work for the child, adult, and family. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to some of our focus, given the focus of this conference on resilience. So here's another definition from some folks in the field. I know there are many gurus out here in the room, even Dr. Carl Bell, for instance, who's done a lot of work on resilience and protective factors. But what we know is that resilience includes the process, capacity for outcome for successful adaptation despite challenging circumstances. So we know this from experience, but many of these youth who have gone through trauma, many adults who have gone through trauma, do well in many different areas. And how can we support that in our professional role? Where there's something called protective factors, where we can work closely with these individuals in identifying what some of these key things are that are going well so that we can then increase the likelihood of positive outcomes. I'm going to skip some of this just because I know Tonier will be talking about it, because I want to talk a little bit about what we can do in our professional roles. But this is just what I've listed out here are some of the individual factors and environmental or system kinds of factors that do support recovery from trauma. And I think the key thing on the environmental side, and this is related to a lot of the work that we all do as professionals, as caregivers, is the importance of ongoing supportive relationships, both within and with outside the family. The importance of secure attachments, cohesion, and ties to the community are really critical. I'm going to skip this, and I'm going to just go into a couple of different strategies for what we can do in our work and in our professional role. So just some general guidelines to keep in mind when you're establishing a trauma-informed system or trauma-informed practice. And these are things that we know already, but I think just some good rules to keep in mind. Understanding that trauma is often the rule, not the exception, and cumulative trauma in particular is often more common. And there's a range of experiences, signs, and symptoms that we need to be on the lookout for. Recognizing that bad behavior is sometimes an adaptation to trauma, and oftentimes an adaptation to trauma if they are traumatized, versus not them having developed age-appropriate capacities. These are all things that can be made available afterwards, but this is kind of a compilation of things from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, how we can take on a trauma-informed practice or improve our practices in whatever work that we're doing around routinely screening for trauma, conducting a comprehensive assessment, integrating culturally appropriate and responsive practices, whatever they may be, using things or with some level of evidence base that we know have some effectiveness, engaging in efforts to build resilience and protective factors both at an individual level and at a community level, working with parent trauma, enhancing our communication with both caregivers, family members, and other providers to really enhance this work and really make it a continuous trauma-informed system of care. And then I think this part around resiliency is really critical because I think the more work we can do, both as individuals, as caregivers, as providers, to strengthen those ties to other supportive adults within the child's life, within the community, teaching problem solving, building strengths, I think is really the critical part of recovery from trauma. And something that folks may be aware of, June, which starts now, as you know, is National PTSD Awareness Month. So this is an opportunity. There's a lot of resources out there. The National Center for PTSD, which is more of the adult-focused website, as well as an NCTSN, have some terrific resources where you can continue to build your skill in understanding trauma. So be on the lookout for that. There may be opportunities locally in your community and nationally to really take advantage of some of these educational opportunities. And there's a lot of great resources to be aware of in Illinois. The Illinois Statewide Provider Database, which is a great resource for understanding the types of resources in your community, specifically for children and families, and then resources more nationally across the country that you can be aware of to guide some of your work around enhancing trauma-informed practices. So thank you very much.